Let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
This is so awesome.
We are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big
importance of
piece
What is that process that a developer, or let's say
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed?
Welcome to In the Clouds. I am your host, Stu Miniman, and we're going to be talking today one of my favorite topics. We're talking about data. And of course, we know there's been huge explosions of data over the last few decades. It's one of those exponential things. The only constants in our industry are change, in that, all of the information will continue to pile up. We create the Library of Congress, probably in milliseconds at this point, if I know what's going on. And what has the cloud era taught us? We've really gone beyond what humans can manage alone. So the topic we're going to talk about that weave together a number of these things is AIOps. And no one better to talk to us about this topic than the AIOps lead at Red Hat. So I'd like to welcome Marcel Hild, who is the AIOps lead, part of the Red Hat Office of the CTO, or Octo as they're often known. Marcel, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Stu. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right.
In the clouds. Yes.
Yeah.
What a
In
better
the
place to
clouds,
be.
and we do these events. You're coming to us from your home office in Germany. If you could just give us a little bit about your background, what led you to this focus that you've had for a number of years on the AIOps trend that we're going to talk about.
Sure. So my background is in open source. For like 25 years. I'm doing open source since university, and I think I played most of the roles in this game, from a solution architect to a developer, freelance developer, to somebody operating machines. And I came back to Red Hat like 6 years ago and worked on a cloud management software called ManageIQ, or CloudForms as the product. And then this AI Center of Excellence at Red Hat started, and I was listening to an internal talk by Ulrich Trepper, this guy who worked on the libc for some time. And I figured this is a super interesting topic. I want to be part of this. And so I came to AIOps because cloud management and this overlap with AI is AI operations. And that's basically my journey into this. And since the last 3 years, I've came as a noob into this environment. And I think now I have a pretty good opinion on where things stand, and what the open source angle on this is.
Well, yeah, Marcel, of course, being at Red Hat, we all have some angle on open source. It's crazy for me to think, I was a product manager for Linux over 2 decades ago, just to date myself a little bit. So I had, quite a bit of history with open source before I joined Red Hat a little over a year ago. I also have a little bit of history with Octos. So I was really surprised that Chris Short, who used to host this, had not yet interviewed Chris Wright. And if I have it right, you're the first Octo member we've had on the program. So every company does things a little bit. At Red Hat, of course, everyone's involved in open source. So can you help us understand a little bit the structure of, the Octo inside Red Hat?
Sure. Apart from a fancy name, Octo, which always reminds me of an octopus, but it's also very describing, and I think it's a good picture, because octopuses are super intelligent. If their parents wouldn't die when they were born, I think they would even maybe they would exceed human intelligence. So they are really learning during their short lifespan so many exciting things. And that's, I think, how the Octo, the office of the CTO, is different at Red Hat from other companies because we only have one CTO and we only have one office of the CTO. And that has grown over the past. So when I joined, it was a smaller team, mostly pictured as the office of the CTO stands at a conveyor belt and identifies all the open source projects and communities out there, and the good ones stay on the conveyor belt, and then products and technologies turns that into products. I think that evolved over time, and now we're also looking more also into how our internal culture looks like, our relationships with communities. I mean, that's been there before, but we've been growing our family of the office of the CTO. Also now ecosystems engineering, partner systems engineering is also part of the office of the CTO.
All right, let's turn and discuss AIOps. So, hopefully, most of our audience are familiar with many of the, things like DevOps, the movements that pull together, some technologies, DevSecOps, so something we as a company overall are doing. AI is a little bit of a fuzzy term sometimes. There's artificial intelligence, there's machine learning and the like. I remember I attended a conference back in 2019, which was all about AIOps. So there had been a real spike in this discussion. If you could just level set our audience for AIOps, what's the high level message? Where has it been, and where are we today when it comes to the industry as a whole for AIOps?
Yes, sure. So AIOps initially started as a term coined by Gartner. I don't know when, but it was before the big AI hype. It actually started out as not artificial intelligence for operations, but algorithmic. Now I'm blanking on the term, but it was basically algorithms, so not really AI. And now they change it to AI, because if you say AI, you get more funding for it, rather than doing analytics and just algorithmic stuff. But I think it still boils down to this idea to use data science, to use algorithms and machine learning, data engineering applied to operations, to monitor, to automate, and to maybe self-heal your environment. Basically, everything that's happening in an operations environment or in a DevOps environment, apply some machine learning, apply some data analytics to it, and you have this AIOps thing happening at your company.
Okay, so Marcel, when we looked at DevOps, one of my favorite lines is DevOps isn't something you can buy, even though there were lots of companies that tried to sell you on their service as something DevOps. Are we talking the same type of things with AIOps? Is much of this organizational and cultural versus a product that you buy that will magically make your data better?
I guess it depends on who you're talking to, right? So if somebody's selling you an AIOps product, which has AIOps in their name, maybe they want to sell you this product which enables AIOps in your team, or which brings AIOps to your setup, to your company. I don't know. And we see a lot of rebranding of old tools with some AIOps stamps slapped on it, and basically it's the same wine in new bottles. I don't know if that's a common idiom, but just rebranding stuff. The DevOps movements, I think it's a really good analogy of what's happening here, because I think, being even more true to the name, it should be called AI DevOps. Because if you take a step back and see what DevOps was all about, it was about using the tooling and the way of thinking of operations in the development team, so that I as a developer could just spin up an environment which is similar enough to the actual production environment on my laptop or on a smaller cluster. And then similarly, the operations tool applying some of the best practices from development, such as versioning your source code or automating a lot of stuff and revision control, etc., in operations. So really using the best of both worlds to create this new persona. And I think now we came to that time in our journey to the clouds and to scale, where it's just too complicated for humans alone to understand it, where our automations might not suffice anymore, where our best practices may not be enough, where we maybe meet some unknowns or something is super unpredictable, where we just use the tools that are in the tool belt of the data scientist, of the machine learner, and apply that to operations.
Yeah, so you brought up the data scientists, and this is one of the challenges we have. Most companies usually don't have an abundance of data science resources. They're difficult to find. You want to maintain them, but getting the value out of data, at least experience I remember talking to data scientists 5 or 10 years ago. They're like, we have all of this data, but we don't necessarily know the right questions to ask. So there was the gap between the subject matter experts and the data scientists. It sounds like, if I'm hearing right, maybe we're flipping, is we're rather than having the data scientists be the center of all of this activity, are we allowing the subject matter experts to be able to leverage some of the things that normally I would have had to be a data scientist to do? Are we democratizing some of that tooling and skill set that we had from data science?
Absolutely. It's about democratizing it and the commoditizing it also, that we can that I can do stuff on my laptop these days where like just some years ago I needed to have multiple really expensive GPUs and hardware to do the same stuff. And now it's really just maybe you saw these videos on YouTube where it just takes like 5 lines of Python code to build a neural net that can actually identify images of cats, right? But it's really just 5 lines of Python code that I copy and paste into my browser. Maybe I need to install some stuff, but then I can actually do this without understanding the real math that is being applied there. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't understand the intuition behind it. So I would encourage people to watch some stuff on YouTube to get the intuition on what data science is all about. That there's those 2 different types of machine learning, like unsupervised and supervised learning. There's deep learning. There's just regression, which is advanced statistics. So know the tooling that you reach out to, and then use some of the democratized libraries out there. So go to scikit-learn, where you have there's even a flow chart where you can just look at the problem domain that you're having, and then it guides you into the best algorithms and the best practices to apply to that problem, and then just try it out and then see if it helps you doing your job better. And I think that's the common misunderstanding that sometimes sometimes misarticulated in advertisements and in other YouTube videos, that we need something net new to solve this stuff. Therefore, we need to learn AIOps. Therefore, we need new tooling and stuff. No, it's actually we need the same tooling. And if the tooling doesn't work anymore, if you hit that barrier of operations where your normal operations doesn't work anymore, where your thresholds don't do the job anymore, and if the linear regression that is maybe built into the tooling that you already have also doesn't work anymore, maybe then reach to AI to do the job, because only then you understand your problem domain so good enough that you can ask questions or you can pose problems that are well suited for AI. Because if you just invite a data scientist to your to your shop and you tell him, well, now make my life better, make it more efficient, then he will also start asking questions. So it's then you need to smarten up the data scientists on your domain. So I think it's way easier to smarten up your folks that already know your domain really well, namely operations and DevOps, and then invite the data scientists to help them solve problems that you pose. So it's not the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Marcel, that's great. It is one of the huge value propositions of cloud in general. Is I no longer need to be a nation state or have some ridiculous budget. That democratization, the availability of the tooling and a lower bar for the skill set that we need to learn. We actually got a question in from the audience. Andrew Sullivan, who's the host of Ask an OpenShift Admin, asked, is AIOps different than the preemptive proactive actions taken by monitoring systems or other things like more advanced OpenShift operators? So, maybe if you could drill down a little bit and help us differentiate what you're talking about.
It's a good question. I think it's essentially it's the same, and I think it can be applied to the same ideas. So being preemptive or proactive means that you anticipate something happening in the future, and you can do that with some hard-coded rules or maybe some more advanced logic that's codified into these operators, which then take action if they see a pattern emerge or if they see something going wrong. Maybe they evacuate a pod, or maybe they restart your application because they saw that pattern over and over again. Now, using AIOps in that term would just mean exchange that piece of handwritten logic which you wrote or which you created based on the experience that your AI, your brain experienced previously, and replace that with some heuristics that might be deep learning, really at the far edge, but might be just linear regression or some advanced statistics in the first step, where you just use some tooling in that language that uses statistics to do the same job. So it's really the same patterns, the same tools, but with a data science angle applied to it. But that, to enable that, you need to have the data in the first place. So the first step is you need to have operations, right? So you need to get your your house cleaned, your environment really well in shape for having all access to all the data that you need to do proper root cause analysis, to do proper monitoring. If that's all in place and you have some automation attached to it because you can script stuff, and then you reach a barrier where you can even take that next step. Maybe you don't need to take that next step. Maybe all is really super easy and you don't need to apply AI to it. But if you fail with your automation, or you could do better, apply some machine learning to it, apply some statistics to it, maybe it's then learning the data and the observations that have been in the past. So you might store your data over the past, and then you build up that AI knowledge in your team, and then you apply AIOps to it.
All right, Marcel, I wonder if you could help us connect the dots. We talk mostly about the cloud on this show. So most of you were talking about things that, it doesn't require too much. You pull out your laptop, you do it. When you talk about data, though, a lot of the data lakes now are living in the cloud. Moving data, isn't necessarily an easy thing. Physics still rules. So how much of what you're talking about, is it a public cloud thing? How does edge play into it? Any guidance you can give as to where do people start looking when it comes to, there's a question up there, reference architectures, the whole flow of activity. We don't have time to, whiteboard and do everything else, but where do we start and where do we go for more resources on that?
Yes. Very good question. So first and foremost, I don't think that you need to start from scratch. It's pretty much like, or it should be like this image detection or cat image detection problem that I said. Nobody will train a a complete ImageNet based on all the images. They just use the pre-trained models that are out there to identify cats. And I think the same is true for identifying outliers for anomaly detection. So most of the time, it's time series data that we're dealing with. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel to do something like resource prediction, like predict the future. When will my storage run out of space? What's the seasonality of my access logs, right? So in winter, I have more access because I'm selling tires, and I have that spike where the climate changes. Maybe I use that to extract seasonality out of my time series because I have an influx of requests to my web shop. So I don't write the software from scratch. I use something that's already out there, which is dealing with time series data. And that's where cloud comes in. If we are talking about cloud, I'm talking about a cloud native approach. That means containers, that means probably Kubernetes or OpenShift orchestration, that means CNCF projects that contribute to this. So for time series data, it's Prometheus. That's all over the place. People are doing these days monitoring with Prometheus. If you are not doing it with Prometheus, you can also apply these tools, but it will be harder, right? So and there's a lot of examples that my team has created on the internet, but you also find a lot of other examples working with time series data with Prometheus in the cloud. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you are operating the platform or parts of the platform. That can also mean that you're operating your application, which is, again, instrumented with some metrics that are emitted via Prometheus. And I think that's the nice thing about the cloud these days, that we have so many defined standards across the whole stack. So you will see the same metrics, not the same metrics, but the same schema of metrics being emitted throughout the whole stack. So you don't have to reinvent your tooling if you travel up or down the stack, but you can just reapply it, right? And I think that's the beauty of it. It's a little bit like Lego blocks, and they all mix and match. But I think even Duplo Lego and Lego blocks, Duplo and Lego
Duplow's
matches.
the big ones. So,
Yeah, but I think they also match. They're just a different scale.
yeah. Marcel, maybe let's, if we can we make this a little bit real? So my understanding, one of the ways that we internally do this is Red Hat. We have what we call the remote health monitoring. So all of the all of the clusters out there from a Kubernetes standpoint, data comes back, and of course it's all anonymized. But being able to understand trends and learn from what the community is doing is something that open source has a long history of, and is one of those great drivers of data-driven insights. So maybe walk us through that as an example of how AIOps fits into learning things and maybe changing what we do with something like the remote health monitoring.
Yes. I think that there are two questions. So one is this remote health monitoring, which I think is an excellent example where we apply machine learning to something that on the first look doesn't look like operations. But I think it's AIOps in its truest sense. And then the second part is how do we treat, or what's the open source angle there? So remote health monitoring basically means all the OpenShift clusters out there that have opted into remote health monitoring. So it's not mandatory, like you said, but you can send a piece of your operational metrics back to Red Hat. That's like what's the overall error rate of operators failing, and what's the state of operators are in, what's the memory consumption. So really something that doesn't expose any of the workloads that you're running there, but it exposes like it says, the health of the cluster. And the idea is that we treat the whole fleet of clusters out there as basically as connected devices, and can identify problems at certain clusters, actively debug them with the customer if needed, or maybe even identify the root cause of the problem without contacting the customer, and then proactively fixing that before it affects a larger set of customers, or before it becomes a real problem, so to say. And then also influence the product, right? So something might start as, oh, I have this flipping state of an operator. It doesn't have any effect, but there's probably something wrong. So let's dig into that and fix the bug before it actually becomes a real severe issue, right? So I think that's the user experience you usually get from a cloud environment, where the cloud hyperscaler can look into all the workloads that are being run in the cloud and then make the overall cloud experience better. And that's something that we also need to enable for hybrid deployments, for basically all the products that are deployed out there, to send back some telemetry data so that we can make the products better, and also to escape that traditional, here's a release, customer, please install the release, and we will fix the other bugs in the next release, which is half a year away. No, but have this over-the-air upgrades, constant rollout of updates, something that we are used to with these devices here, where we get an update all the time, right? And which are also sending back developer feedback to developers, and applying machine learning to that internally is something that I would also call AIOps. So what are we doing with this telemetry stream, which is again just Prometheus data, a time series from many clusters? So we're looking at these streams, and we cluster the data to identify interesting, larger clumps of outliers, or not of outliers, but clumps of pools of clusters where some problems might occur, which are happening at a larger scale or at a smaller scale, where we can then make data-driven decisions where to look at next, because we only have so many developers, so they can't monitor all the bugs and issues, but we can identify issues that affect a larger fleet or have a higher severity. So it helps us to basically guide our attention and focus where we put our efforts next to. So that's also AIOps, although it's not really us operating a cluster, but we apply AI to an operational problem.
All right. And you said you wanted to address kind of just the open source angle of what's happening.
Yes. So that's probably not really open sourcing, because we're not open sourcing that data. It's customer data. Maybe it's like crowdsourcing. Yeah. But I think it's going into that important direction where, let's think about it. These image nets that identify cat images, or these agents that we the smart home assistants from Amazon, Alexa or Google or Siri. They work because we threw a lot of data at those companies. So Google has all the images, so they could label all the cat images. We were constantly talking to our phones, so we had enough voice data to train those models. How is that with operational data? Show me one customer that exposes his operational data, meaning those metrics that we just talked about, the log files, the incidents, basically everything that you need to operate your environment, and share that with the world. Nobody does that for obvious reasons, right? There might be some privacy identifying information in there, or there you might expose that you actually suck at operating your environment, so you don't expose it to the world. So nobody's really sharing that data. And at the first step, using our trust as Red Hat with customers to share that data with us as a trusted partner, I think that's a step into the right direction, so that customer A gets the benefit from customer B sharing his data with us because we solved customer's A problem before he actually ran into that problem, because customer B already ran into that problem. So that takes it to the next level. But now think about applying open source to it, where we would also operate similar workloads in a community context, where not products, but projects, like a MySQL project or a PostgreSQL project or a Kubernetes project, would operate parts of a cloud environment completely in the open, creating true open source data sets for metrics, for failures of systems, for the log files and all the incidents that have been created and then have been resolved. That creates a large set of data where then data scientists can come into play and say, look, we had this incident happening 2 years ago, and now we have a data set of 5 years worth of data across many, many hybrid cloud environments. Let's try to predict this incident that happened 2 years ago based on the knowledge that we have and that we have seen. And then we can do something that is really preemptive and really proactive in resolving issues, because we trained models that are based on a really on a common knowledge. So applying democratization also to the data itself. I think that's the next step, and then ship that to the larger industry. And I mean, if we're talking about community, it's not like back in the days where we did something as students and we haven't seen a paycheck for it. No, it's actually people being paid for this, and they are working in these communities. So that's my call out to all the hyperscalers and customers out there. If we operate stuff in the open, we can also create data sets that are truly open and then make AIOps a real thing.
Yeah, Marcel, I think it's a great step along the trajectory we've seen for a long time. When I think early in my career, IT kept everything that they did very close to the vest. Oh, this is special. We're going to build a temple to every application. We're not going to tell anybody how we do this. Now most customers understand, if I'm going to take advantage of all the innovation happen in the industry, I need to be talking to my peers. Running certain pieces of IT isn't what differentiates me. It's the relationships I have. It's the people I have. It's the business that I run on top of IT that matters. And IT needs to be close to that. And not only sharing, best practices, but as you're saying, if we can leverage community data, that would take things even further. So Marcel, we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that there was a lot of hype for a few years about AIOps. Is it the natural diffusion of technology and the wave of adoption feels like we're a little bit past the peak of the hype? Oftentimes there are stumbling blocks, or companies have failures or they move away from things. So what are you and your team? What do you see? What are some of those stumbling blocks? What are some of the common things that people will go down a path and be like, oh, forget it, I give up? How do we help move things forward as an industry as a whole?
As a whole, that's a tough question. I think this operate first idea is the lever to move things really forward.
Yeah, and I guess maybe talk to from an individual customer standpoint.
Yes,
what are the things that what are the top things? Say, hey, if you don't do A, B, or C, you're going to fail. Or here's some of the anti-patterns that you need to avoid.
Yes, on that smaller scale, it's usually managing expectations. So I had so many calls that I have been pulled into where a customer says, I want to do AIOps. And a lot of the times they are not really operating. So really managing that expectation that AIOps doesn't solve the mess that you currently have. So it doesn't help you get better at operations. It helps you get better if you're already doing operations good. So that's the first thing. So really understand that to do AI ops, you have to do ops before. If you are at that level, try to come up with an homogeneous environment. So if your landscape is super, super diverse and you have a lot of different APIs and you have a lot of different teams working on stuff, start out with a small subset of your tooling, of your environment. And best would be to start out with a cloud native environment, because that's where most of the traction these days happens. And start out with a small team. Because again, AIOps, it's not a technology, it's a mindset. Like you can't buy DevOps, you can't buy AIOps, but you need to enable your staff, your engineers, to step up from being DevOps folks to become AIOps folks. So start with a small team and enable them, give them a lot of freedom to practice stuff and let them work on something that is not really mission critical, but where they can apply something and then learn and adopt that culture. Be more data driven. I mean, that sounds hypocritic to some extent, even we, but also Red Hat is not super data driven. So we also sometimes just do gut decisions. And I'm trying to apply also the data-driven philosophy to my team, to the way that we are doing things. So make really data-driven decisions. And that means you can also apply this data science tooling to your team structure or to basically to any decision that you're doing. So at the end of the day, a Jupyter notebook, this is the table stakes for doing machine learning or data science in a browser environment. A Jupyter notebook becomes something similar to our team, became something similar and equally important to our team as the terminal command line and Git. And I think that's actually a good example. So we had a data science team and a dev team. And the data scientists, they needed to smarten up on using Git, using GitHub, using pull requests, all the tooling that the other folks already knew. And the other folks are now using Jupyter notebooks to convey some prototypes, or to basically use them as a first primitive in their day-to-day work.
Yeah, Marcel, the term you've used a lot is operate first. If people want to learn more about the principles of operate first and what your team's doing, where are some of the places that they can learn more?
Sure, that's easy. Operate-first.cloud is the website. There's a mailing list, and there's a lot of GitHub organizations, and that's really this. It's one of the. I think it's the first completely, truly open cloud environment where you can peek into the back of the data center, the back of the operations office was just a GitHub handle. So you have a single sign-on with GitHub, and you can click on the OpenShift console link, and you will be in the OpenShift console, and you can see what's running there. You can't deploy stuff, obviously, but you see what's running there. And then you go into the GitOps repositories, where we have all the applications or the workloads that are being deployed there, managed in a forward-looking style, how we would do GitOps in a greenfield project. And you can see that. So you would see an application which is in the OpenShift console, and then you can go to the GitOps repository and see how that application is being deployed. And you can even go to the Prometheus instance and see what metrics are being produced there. So it's really a living Hello World example of something that you might want to run in your environment.
Awesome. So we've shared in the chat the website there. Looks like there's also some community meetups happening, and lots more resources. You of course did a session with Chris Wright, our CTO, in Technically Speaking. Definitely one people should check that one out. I'm glad we get to dig a little deeper. So Marcel, final thing for you, I guess, is the last 2 years. Most of us, we're not commuting. We usually, find some hobbies or things to do. I have a feeling that, data plays some role in activities that you're doing. So maybe tell us, what do you play with in your spare time? And any data connections they have.
Yeah. Usually I had a Doom poster at the back of my office. Now I replaced that with a car, but it's not a real car. It's a sim car. So I totally got into sim racing over the past 2 years, which is simulated computer racing with a VR headset. So I'm really sitting in that chair and doing some races because I like this repetitiveness of stuff, and where you do something and then you squeeze out the last bit of perfection out of it by just churning over the stuff that you're doing. And just recently I figured that I'm doing so many rounds and rounds and rounds, but I'm still 5 seconds slower than the real pros. And I feel that there's also some opportunity for AI guided code driver that tells me where I'm actually losing those seconds, because it's too hard for me. I understand it from this perspective, but using some data driven analytics to improve my way of driving, and you get from those sim cars, you get a lot of telemetry sent back. And I actually managed to take that telemetry and feed it into an InfluxDB instance and use Grafana to display those graphs. Actually, I just took the example from another Red Hat engineer. So it was not based on my work, but I deployed that stuff in this Operate First cloud. So I managed to send that data over there and just apply the tooling that we are using in AIOps to the sim racing stuff, which I find super, super funny and interesting. So even in your hobbies, you can do this cross-domain fun stuff and smarten yourself up on stuff that you actually need for work in your spare time.
Yeah, absolutely. In the fitness world, the data-driven results, so you can measure everything against yourself, and either the community or the team can help out. What VR headset are you running with these days?
I started out as a backer for the Oculus kit, so I'm really in there since the first time, and now I ordered this Vero thing. So I'm always trying to get the best stuff. I'm not allowed to travel anymore, so the family doesn't get to go to holidays, so I'm getting the
I need to wrestle the Oculus away from my son, because definitely there's opportunity to travel through the VR headset and check out some of those things. Marcel, really appreciate the conversation. Appreciate sharing with the community, and glad there's lots of ways that people can connect and follow up. So thank you again.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right, we'll be back. We run bi-weekly. Please reach out to me on Twitter at Stu. You can always hit us up on the YouTube channel. Lots of good programming coming to you throughout the year. So appreciate everyone for watching, the comments in here, and joining us for your journey in the clouds.